This is part 5 of the miniseries Blueprints of the Anglo-Dutch Empire. If you haven't watched the first 4 parts, please watch them before continuing watching this part 5. But I'll continue for now. So you had what historians call the American Revolution, the foundation of the then United States. And shortly after the acknowledgement of this new country, it expanded towards the west and containing much Indian territory. And you had New Spain, that was this Spanish colony over here, which also contained the Philippines, but that's not on this map at the moment. But I want to go a little back at the foundation of the US, which contained out of rebellion of the white population, what you could call the white population of the 13 colonies. But their new leader became George Washington. And look, there are conspiracy theories going around that this guy never existed. I'm not going into that. There are historic documents, letters of this man, and there are even statues of him. So I'm not saying all historic records concerning this guy are accurate. I'm not claiming that. Neither am I saying that there are no misinterpretations of historical facts. What I make plain is I'm not going into conspiracy theories in this series. The new United States had a leader, and they had to continue the nation. It is, well, I'm going to admit, it's a bit weird that the 2.4 million, I'm not saying all of them, but the 2.4 million white people, or let me say people you consider white, most of them from England, that lived in the 13 colonies, that they all rebelled against this George guy over here, and that in return they received another George. And there's another thing, the name Washington is an anglicized name of Washita. Washita is an Indian place where later Washington, D.C. was established. Just like Itiwana and Manhattan later became New Amsterdam, New York. Names changed. Well, look, there were Indian kings and Indian chieftains that took anglicized names. They took on English names that were derived from their native names or that looked similar to their native names. Even for another example, today you have people from China that go to the West and they used Western names that sound similar to their Chinese names. For example, you can have a young woman calling Singling or Singli, and in Chinese you may pronounce as Singli, and she may call herself Cindy when she interacts with Western friends. Well, a kind of thing like that was going on at the time that Native Americans adopted anglicized names. Others are saying no, the name Washington is a uncommon surname from England. Anyway, I admit that both the surname and the first name of this man is a bit weird. Okay, but apart from that, a new nation was founded. The millions that rebelled against George Hanover, which is, this guy was the king of Britain at the time, they had now their own nation, which they shed the blood for, because there was bloodshed over there. But here's the thing, when they had their own country, they saw it as their country. And they began to exclude those that did not share their heritage. Because remember, it's the same colonial governments remained, but they changed the flags, they changed the language. English became the dominant state language. And that was a full Republican shape. Now, and not everyone was permitted to vote. In the beginning, I believe only those that had land were entitled to participate in voting concerning the major issues. So the common, what we would call American, had no say whatsoever in what's going on in the Republic. Now, this series is entitled Blueprints of the Anglo-Dutch Empire. Because understand this. When a blueprint of violence has been established, it tends to perpetuate itself throughout history. For another example, you had the Romans invading Britain. They established a town called Londinium, today we call it London. And most in the south they established Roman towns. And because of that, the south became wealthy and many people migrated to the south. Wales, at the time, called Cumbria. Wales was called Cumbria at the time, but they didn't want to submit to Rome. So eventually they treated it as an autonomous part of the province. And between the north and the south, the north they called Caledonia, today we call Scotland, they separated with a wall later on during the reign of Emperor Hadrian. And the ancient Irish tribes were also addressed as one, Hibernia. From Hibernia you have the name Eire, from which we get Ireland. That blueprint at the time is still perpetuating till this day. Till this day you have Ireland, you have Cumbria, which is subjected to Britannia today called England, Cumbria today called Wales, and you still have this country, it's called Scotland, but it's not treated as a country, but it's treated as a part in union with what we call Great Britain. This is just one way how a blueprint can perpetuate itself later on in history. Now, why am I speaking about this? It's because, just think about this. The white population over here, or let me say those of European descent, they revolted against George Hanover. They were rioting, they were violent, they didn't want to take oppression anymore. All right. They didn't want the indenture camps, they didn't want the aristocracy, they didn't want all of that all that mistreatment. But they left the same structure in place. The British net owners were not expelled, neither did they cancel out the investments of the aristocrats from Europe. When they had their nation, they turned against the Native Americans. They even made legislation that no one was permitted to carry a royal title. That means that all the Native American kings and Native American chieftains, they were forced to integrate in a white man's system. Because remember, the colonial states was between the Hanover House and the European descent population that lived over here. The Indians, or let's say Native Americans, and others were not included. And the whole revolution was an issue between the European descents over here and motherland Britain over there. So where does this leave the Native Americans or the blacks? They were excluded. So when they had their country, which they fought for, they began to exclude everyone that was not, how I would say, was not a white man, or did not share the white man heritage. So racism is something that was bred in this part. It's an integral part of the system. I'm not saying that all people that lived at the time were racist, of those European descent population. Absolutely not. I'm not saying that. But in the structure, racism was included. The colonial structure that only included white people, that continued as the United States. And their rage against George disappeared from the picture, but now they had a new boogeyman, which were the Indian nations over here. Soon, their attention turned against against the British again, because in 1812 the British, because they didn't, the United States didn't follow on with the Treaty of Paris, another war, Britain invaded the United States and it burned down the White House. Relations were later restored again, and shortly afterwards, British North America became independent within the British Empire, and the common name for that, for British North America, was Canada, and that's the name the nation carries still this day. But so after the British, it became the Spanish Empire, and when New Spain, say this, New Spain over here, became independent in around, I believe it's around 1820, it became this Mexican Empire, which later became a republic, because this part was sold by Napoleon to the United States. How can this be? It's Spanish territory. Well, Napoleon also invaded Spain and made his elder brother king of Spain. So this territory became French for a while, and Napoleon used that opportunity to get income, and then the United States used it to expand themselves. But that was not enough. They later, the cowboys, which contained both blacks and white people and also Native Americans, well, what I'm trying to say is that cowboys were not just white men on horses riding around in the wild, wild west. But you had this group of, I call them thugs, from the European descent population, which they were called Americans, that began to invade Texas, which was a Mexican republic, and later this was annexed by the United States. Florida was already bought over from the Spaniards, though to those people over here moving over here all the time and claiming the land. Eventually, Spain sold it on them under pressure. Texas was taken over by the Mexicans. Later, the half of Mexico became U.S. territory. Also, California, which was an independent republic, became a U.S. State. So you may think now this was in the middle of the 19th century that it would be over. No. During this whole time, you also had the black men, which most of them were slaves at the time. They were black, you could say black people that were free, they had their own enterprise that even slaves benefited from. But shortly after the abolishment of slavery, you had a black economy arising in the South, which was quite successful. And they even had their own facilities, their own institutions, apart from the European descent population, which were the Americans. This caused envy. So now the black men, which should be considered Americans, became the enemy. And you had the lynchings of what you could call black people throughout US history. Just look it up for yourself. Lynchings of black people in the United States. You can go to a library, you can use Google, or you can use both. You'll be shocked how many lynchings there were. But then also the Native Americans that remained with their own territories, they became also a target. Because here's the thing, during the 13 colonies, you had indenture camps, or I would say concentration camps, that the population wanted to be relieved from. But those same camps, they later reproduced and put the Native Americans in. So, the blueprint of violence that upon which the country was founded was repeated over and over again. Every time they saw for another boogeyman. And you all know that, well, during the interbellum, this between the First and Second World War, a new boogeyman was developing. It wasn't the boogeyman for USA yet, but Adolf Hitler became a boogeyman. But also Japanese were boogeymen already, because the Japanese Empire was perceived as a threat to Western colonial powers, and also it was also perceived as a threat by the USA, because Japan wanted to annex the Philippines from the Spanish, but the USA wanted to do that. And later in World War II, they dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan. After that, the Russians, the Soviets were the boogeymen. Then, but also Fidel Castro, which was considered in partnership with the Soviets, also became a boogeyman. And so when you look careful at it, this whole resentment against Mr. Hanover over here, this has continued throughout generations, even though Mr. Hanover himself died. His royal line, the Hanovers, also they declined economically and politically, and also culturally they declined. Yet the Saxe-Coburg-Gotha household taking over Britain later on, which was also a German royal bloodline. And the people that revolt against men, they also passed away, but their descendants and the people that joined this new nation, they kept the same blueprint of violence. There was always a boogeyman that needed to be resisted. And it always resulted in bloodshed. And that were the times that made the nation great. Well, you also had the Civil War in the USA. I'm not going to speak much about that. It's the same thing, but then you had internal conflict because it was uncertain who was the boogeyman. The people in the South perceived Abraham Lincoln as a boogeyman. The people in the North had other ideas. It was kind of a crisis for the nation at the time. And today we have Kim Jong-un and Bashar al-Assad that are perceived as a boogeyman. I say this at the time of this recording. For those in the future who will watch this video, at the time of this that I make this video in 2017 in May, there are Bashar al-Assad, who is the president of Syria, is perceived as a boogeyman, and also Kim Jong-un, the leader of the alleged North Korea. I won't go into North Korea now, but you get what I mean. So what's the point? Throughout history, this nation that was a nation established through bloodshed. They want to get rid of George over here, but in the process they became just like George, and they did worse than they became like the Hanovers, and they did worse than the Hanovers to their own and to other people, and also the descendants did it, continued with it. There was an influx of immigration in the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. Those were naturalized as Americans, so they are not all the descendants of the people that lived in this time, but they adapted the blueprint of violence, the spiritual blueprint of violence that was established in this era. So many people don't see that connection. When they see the news or when they perceive what's going on today, they think it's something new. But as the Bible says, there's nothing new under the sun. In general, it means simply that history tends to repeat itself. Of course, the exact situation cannot repeat itself, absolutely not, but similar things repeat itself in later generations. And when you look at, for example, if you have a population that was enslaved, let's say that you have one African tribe enslaving another African tribe, in later generations there will still be marks and consequences will reflect what happened in the past. And people and the descendants of the enslaved population may carry a collective sense of inferiority or a sense of resentment towards the descendants of the dominant group. So it's a blueprint of violence reproducing. So I wanted to point that out. So you cannot understand US history, neither the developments of the USA today and its influence on the world, if you don't understand how the Anglo-Dutch Empire came into being, and what for effect it had on history. Because effects are continuing until this day. As that's obvious. But understand this well. racism, and I'm not sure if I've explained this before, but racism is a sex disorder. Why? It works kind of like this. We have men in a community that want validation that they are men. One way they do this is by performance and by finding a mate, a wife. And let's say they succeed. Their motivation is to be validated by other men. So that relationship or that marriage, it has a wrong foundation. Let's say it's not a marriage, but just a relationship. It has a wrong foundation. If this happens a few times, people tend to become resentful, the men I mean, but they don't see that the fault or the error is in their own thinking. So what happens then, when they see other people who are not similar to them being successful, let's say in relationships, they tend to perceive them as a threat, and their error is now projected onto those other people. And then men that have the similar mindset join together against those other men that they resent, and now they form an image of them that so-called has to reflect the whole group, that has to reflect the other. In this case, you have a lot of what you could call white men or European descent people and those men perceive, for example, colored men as a threat, and they begin to project all their errors upon them. And those errors are often sex-related. And now, because now all the errors are projected onto them, now they seek validation to fight against that group, to be relieved. So that's why often when leaders, fascist leaders arrive, they tend to blame immigrants, or they try to form a group called the other, and they often use bodily and sexual suggestive language or words to talk about the other in their policies. Why? Because it works. By the way, there is no such thing as human races. There's only one race, a human race. So there's no such thing as biracial or multiracial. You're either you're either descendant of human seed or you're not. You're either from the seed of man, or you are a seed of man or you're not. There is no such thing as, well, you get what I'm saying. But this whole construction of race, as I explained before, it derives from ancient Egypt during the Ptolemaic dynasty of Greece, during the Greek Ptolemaic dynasty, where you had a Greek, or let me say better, Macedonian general of Alexander the Great, Alexander from Macedon, that established the Greek Empire. Ptolemy took over the area of Egypt, Libya, and Judea at the time. And he was the first white ruler of that environment, and he established a worship of Serapis, which is a combination of the Egyptian deities of the Egyptian deity Osiris and the Greek god Apis. And the image of this Serapis was in the image of Ptolemy himself. He calls Ptolemy Soter, and Soter is ancient Greek for savior. So this man installed the worship of white men as saviors of civilization. The Romans later adapted this, and the Romans brought many young Germanic men that they employed in their Roman army, Roman navy. And that's how and through Greco-Roman art, this whole idea of tall white men as saviors and sustainers of civilization emerged. And it remained like that also after the fall of Western Rome. And in the colonial times, this idea of white men, white man worship, which really refers back to the worship of Alexander the Great himself, who was also called Helios or Apollo, the sun god. This has also been used by the colonial rulers, let's say the colonial powers, who were the German/Austrian royal bloodlines that ruled Europe. They used this teaching of the white race, which was built on white man worship, to motivate their colonist populations to work hard. And even though they often had an equal difficult life as black slaves, they received privileges above the black slaves to validate them being part of the white race. So racism, or say white supremacy, is a sexist order. And this disorder has collectively been perpetrated throughout history till this day. And well, that's mainly due to the effects of the Anglo-Dutch Empire, which really is with us till this day, not in this form anymore, but in the form of Wall Street, in the form of the British and American standard banking system, and in the form of what we call the United States, that keeps perpetrating this blueprint of violence against Mr. Hanover, who has been deceased for centuries and was probably heading towards a lake of fire. Well, I'm going to say this is the end of this series. And again, it was not my intention to make an in-depth historical presentation in this series. I just briefly want to point out how the blueprints of the Anglo-Dutch Empire has affected history and how it still affects people till this day, without people being aware of it. Okay, I forgot to mention one thing. This guy, you have more paintings of him, Prince Hall, who is seen as the father of Black Freemasonry. Well, I'm not going to speak much about Black Freemasonry. You can do your own research about it. Just be careful not to lose yourself in the conspiracy theories. One thing I want to mention is that many of the what they call black churches are linked to what they could call Prince Hall Freemasonry. Prince Hall was one of the, we could say, founding fathers of what would become the United States. And the fact alone that he's often not mentioned as one of the founding fathers is already disturbing. Because as I mentioned before, the colonies were intended for white people only, or people from European descent. And when the country became independent, it's the same structure that they used to found the new nation. And I'm not saying that today all Americans, or people that perceive themselves as Americans, that are that have a white skin or a light skin color, that are all racist. Absolutely not. I'm just saying that in the culture and in the structure, racism, that sexist order has been perpetrated. Well, there is hope. You can be delivered, and I recommend you to seek deliverance. And again, you're not responsible for those that came before you. You can't be. You are responsible, however, for being delivered from any demonic stronghold that may have affected you, so that you won't pass it on towards those that will come in the future. That being said, be at peace.